Welcome to this episode of Never Better Than Late. I'm your host, Bill Lake. Today's guest is stand-up Adam Muller. Adam is a transplanted Canadian who moved to New York not to pursue comedy, but a career on Wall Street. Adam shares how he first stepped on stage when he took a stand-up comedy class to improve his business presentation skills, but never stepped on stage again until 10 years later when he left the corporate world and began pursuing stand-up comedy at age 40. Since our conversation, Adam has released a great stand-up comedy special on YouTube called According to Plan. Check that out. Before we get to our chat, here's a little clip of Adam's stand-up.
I can't believe it's been over a year since New York reopened, right? Time is just flying by. Like, I remember back in April of last year when the comedy clubs first reopened, and we're all getting back on stage. I was just, so rusty. It made me think, I wonder if a brain surgeon ever took, 9 months off. Came back and was like, look, guys, the first one might not go well.
Hey, everybody. Really excited to have today's guest on Never Better Than Late, comedian Adam Muller. Adam, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Good to see you in the virtual world. Like many people, we met in the Zoom days of 2020 and did a number of shows together. We'll talk about that later, whether we thought that was a good thing or a bad thing. And then we finally met. I looked it up September of last year, 2021.
Oh.
Came upstate to do a show here in Binghamton. So,
well, that was September. That feels.
I know. It didn't seem like it was that long ago.
No, it doesn't. Yeah.
Crazy. Well, so this podcast is all about people that started comedy a little bit later in life. So let's start with how old were you when you first dipped your toes in the stand-up comedy world?
I mean, I had taken a class once back in my early 30s, but just took the class. I didn't do anything. It was just kind of a fun once a week thing for six weeks. But I didn't really start till I was pushing 40.
Okay.
Which seems like exceptional. Sometimes, I don't know if you ever heard this. Sometimes I'll hear someone on a podcast talked about how they started really late, and someone will be like, when did you start? And they'll say 27. And I'm like, get out of here.
I know. Well, part of the reason I started this is because the number of times a younger comic who lived outside of the city, but was in their 20s and was planning on moving to the city,
right,
would talk about it. And then they'd say to me kind of without thinking, are you ever going to do that? And it was just such a difference in perspective of where, my age and where I'm at with my life. But you actually moved to New York well before you started doing stand-up. Is that correct?
Yeah, because I was working in finance and stuff. So I was in New York anyway,
okay,
more or less. So I didn't move to New York to do comedy.
Right. You moved there for career reasons.
Right. It was I guess a happy coincidence that since I started doing comedy, I was already here. Assuming that this is a good place to start.
So you had no intention whatsoever of doing stand-up when you initially moved to New York?
No. I was going to run Wall Street. Look how that turned out.
So had you done any stand-up prior to moving to the city at all, or had you thought about it even?
No, I hadn't done stand-up. I hadn't thought about doing it. I hadn't. In fact, I was a fan of stand-up in the sense that when I saw it and happened upon it, I liked it. But I wasn't a fan where I was consuming it and seeking it out. And I wasn't one of those sort of stand-up geeks that knows everything about it, in their teenage years and stuff. I'd heard a little bit. And when I'd watch Letterman every once in a while and there'd be a stand-up on, that was great. But I wasn't, it would never even entered my, thought process that was an option, that you could just do it.
Right. I think that's true. Well, you grew up in Toronto, right? Is that correct?
Yes.
So there's a comedy scene there, obviously.
Oh, for sure.
But I think it's a common thing for people like myself. I grew up upstate New York. That's a very common thing. You don't see people doing it. You don't know people who went and did it. It doesn't seem like a possibility when you're in a smaller area like that.
Right.
I do think that's a pretty common experience, but I find that interesting that you hadn't really thought about it at all growing up in a place that has a pretty vibrant comedy scene and had already been in New York for a while. For somebody to actually go in now to where you're kind of all in.
Oh yeah.
That's a pretty big leap.
Yeah. I don't know. It's interesting because when I took the comedy class, I think it was more, my memory of it is more that like I did a lot of, you know, I was an investment banker. And so you're meeting with a lot of management teams and you're sitting down in a boardroom with the CEO and CFO of multi-billion dollar companies or their boards of directors. And you're making these presentations about companies they should buy or things they should do, you know, from a corporate finance perspective. And I was always so nervous about it. And I was like, how do I get more comfortable with kind of public speaking? And I didn't think taking some PowerPoint presentation class was a good use of time. And for some reason, I locked in on, I think I was just on Google one day and realized that there were stand-up classes. And I thought, oh, if I go do that and try to be funny, then telling the CEO of Johnson and Johnson they should buy this other pharma company, that'll be easy, you know. And that was my motivation for taking the class in the first place. It had nothing to do with like, oh, my dream of comedy, I'm finally going to give it a shot.
That's interesting. So, but by virtue of taking that class, I'm assuming you became a little bit more interested in.
Well, I really enjoyed the class and I really enjoyed the graduation. It was, you know, I think a standard format where it's almost like effectively it's a feedback mic once a week with the teacher of the class giving the feedback, and then a bringer show at the end, right? That's effectively what the class structure is. Which, by the way, no, I'm not criticizing that. I think clearly stand-up's a learn by doing type of art form, if you want to call it that. So it works. And the show is just so much fun that I never forgot it. And like 10 years later, when like I was at a job and the job ended, like they closed our group and laid off a bunch of people. And I had some time for the first time in a decade. And someone's like, hey, you used to always talk about that stand-up class. You should like do that again. And I actually went back and took the exact same class with the exact same teacher like 10 years later. Only that time when it ended, I just went full speed.
So there was a 10-year gap between
the one class and the other and the next class. Yeah.
Wow.
Which is funny because I think, oh man, imagine if I just kept going the first time. Which isn't practical because with the job I had, there was no time. But
sure. But with hindsight, again, with a later age, we kind of look back and say, what if I had that extra amount of time under my belt?
I also wish I'd never quit playing the piano when I was in 5th grade, right? It'd be great to play the piano now. But like, so you can play that game all day long. But yeah, it's interesting that I did, you know, one show and then waited 10 years.
I had somewhat similar experience, not that big of a gap, but I had been writing jokes for other people, but I hadn't done stand-up.
Oh.
I went to one open mic and happened to meet a local comic who also did some local shows.
Okay.
And he gave me a guest spot maybe a few weeks later. So I had done 5 minutes at the mic, 5 minutes on the open spot, and then maybe did another one a year or two later.
Okay.
So did those 3 things and then never went back for several years. It was just, okay, I tried that. That was interesting. So that's quite a gap for you. And even the motivation of the class wasn't necessarily stand-up. Did you see yourself up to that point as like the funny person in your friend group,
right,
in your work group?
I was always the person, like I've always been that person where when someone just throws up a layup and the joke is right there, like I was always the person I wasn't going to let that go by without making the obvious joke. But I was also the guy at work, like there'd be some tense moments because you're dealing with a lot of money. And I was the person that would deflate the tension with some absurd joke at 3 a.m. when you're trying to get a deal announced before the market opens the next day and everyone is just starting to want to kill each other and it's really tense. To just a little bit of levity sometimes helps. And I was always that guy. But I think that but I think I had a good sense of when not crossing a line where then you become making everyone unproductive and they get mad at you, and not doing anything that would be inappropriate.
Well, yeah, that's a high stakes environment.
But also sometimes you just need someone to be like, hey, you know, we're gonna get there. It's 3 a.m. Let's just have a laugh for 10 seconds and then we'll go back to it. And it actually helps.
Well, there's a parallel between that, deflating that tension in that moment, kind of just off the cuff, and what stand-up is a lot of times. Right? Whether you knew you were training for it or not, maybe you got a glimpse, even subconsciously, you were equipped for it.
That's interesting. Yeah, because recognizing that there is tension and then having your brain find the way to diffuse it, which often is how you create a laugh situation. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Not that there's ever any tension when you're performing stand up.
or maybe the other piece of that is eventually you have to learn, and maybe it's even the harder part, is learning how to create the tension.
Right.
Because if you're just out in life and you're the person that recognizes tension and can make the joke to deflate it, that's really great. And that's kind of like the person everyone loves hanging out with. But if that's the difference between being the funny guy with your friends and the guy on stage, is you now have to you have to be able to go into any environment and create the tension and then deflate it. Like creating the moment. I wonder if that's harder than, you know what I mean? It's like the setup versus the punch kind of.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's the key to writing, is you're sometimes making stuff up or exaggerating something that happened. Yeah. And understanding how to create it first. It's almost like a fiction and then a release.
Sure.
But I still think you're falling back on those same muscles that you used and you developed when you were
maybe
doing it in the moment. That's interesting. So we talked about Zoom a little bit, and I wondered if, because again you started later, and we all have this idea there's an arc to somebody's career and that 10-year thing before you get good.
Yeah.
Did you experience any anxiety in 2020 and into 2021 that you felt like you were falling behind or maybe treading water, that you didn't have as much time to go back and start going forward again, like someone maybe in their 20s?
Well, I have always had anxiety about by starting late, you have less time. And so from the very beginning, it was always about trying to be very efficient with the time that I'm allocating to comedy and trying to get the most out of every mic or show or conversation with a comic or learning opportunity. But I think what's interesting is, and like, there are people that are like, it takes 10 years to find your voice and your persona. And then I've heard other people say it takes like 1,000 times on stage, which is just another way of trying to characterize that concept. And I kind of locked in. I said, well, 10 years, that's not realistic. And I, and this was sort of a self-serving thought, but I was like, I get that it takes a lot of people 10 years, but I also think that's based on people that start way earlier, and their first 3 or 4 years in comedy isn't that intense. It skews a little more social than, there's a hobby element. It's a little bit more like I'm hanging out with my friends and having some drinks and having a good time, as opposed to I'm focused on becoming a, professional stand-up comic. Because if you talk to a lot of people, their first 3 or 4 years, like, yeah, I did like one mic a month and a show here and there. So I'm like, okay, it took you 10 years, but that can be done faster. So I was very focused on, if I want every 6 months of what I'm doing to equal 2 to 3 years of the average person who starts, so that I get through those 10 years faster. And I was also like, I wanted to get on stage 1,000 times as fast as I can. And then I'm including an open mic in that 1,000 number. So I was racing. And then when the pandemic hit, obviously there's a ton of uncertainty. Like, what is this? How long is it going to last? What will life be like when it passes? And I sort of tried to trick myself or convince myself that it'll all be okay, right? Which it sort of is. I mean, look, it still exists. We're not out of it, but things are open. People are going to comedy clubs. Live stand-up comedy exists. Versus people in March 2020, they're like, it's gone forever, that kind of attitude. And I tried to look at it as I wish it never happened, but in a positive way for me, given where I was at. Because what I perceived is there's a lot of people that just aren't going to do anything. And there's a lot of people that they just don't, they don't, the one skill I have that a lot of people don't have is I know how to work hard, because I've worked 152 weeks a year, 100 hours a week for a decade. Like, I know what that feels like. And I feel like I feel like I can do a ton of writing, a ton of it's not as good as getting on stage live, but if no one's getting on stage live, but a lot of comics don't like doing the real work, which is the work you don't see, then maybe I can actually use this to like push myself ahead and relative to other comics, and not that it's a zero-sum game and not that it's a competition, but it kind of is sometimes. Like, come out of this way ahead relative to other people than where I started. And that's kind of that was my approach each day, just to get through the day of like, that's why I'm going to do some Zoom mics. That's why I'm going to write every day and always have new stuff and get myself really organized so that when things do come back, I'm just like hit the ground running.
Yeah, I think I approached it the same way. And I had another element because I'm not in a big comedy market, so I don't get on stage as much. I
Right.
almost felt like this gives me a chance, not necessarily to get ahead, but I have less anxiety worrying someone else is getting better faster. Again,
Right.
not that it's a competition, but they're not getting on stage 3 times a night now. And maybe, like you said, a lot of people just didn't do the Zoom stuff because it didn't interest them, and it was honestly
it sucked, but it was
difficult to do.
It was rough, but
Yeah.
But you could write a joke and say it on Zoom and tell if and have a much better sense of it would be if it would be funny in front of live people than if you hadn't done that. And if you did that day after day, months after month, all of a sudden things open back up and you're on stage and someone's like, where did all that stuff come from? It's like, well, I've been working all year.
Yeah.
You know, but I sure hope we never have to do that again.
No, I mean, I don't want to, other than doing things like this or a writing group, I don't want to go back on Zoom at all because you have sort of a PTSD about the worst parts.
No, it's perfect for this.
And we did a writing group.
Yeah, that was great.
And that was one thing that was cool. You could write with people all over the country that you wouldn't normally connect with.
Well, and the networking, because you do some Zoom shows kind of with, like for me, with people I know in New York, we'd all be doing a Zoom mic. Later that night, I might get on a mic that's based at like Flappers in Burbank was running mics every day. And then you're meeting all these people that live in California. And now I've seen some of them in person at a festival or they've come to New York. And so in terms of just building your network, I think a lot of people made comedy networking relationships over Zoom that have provided real benefit now that we're all out in public again.
Yeah, I just did a festival in Ohio last month and I ran into 3 or 4 people that I had only known on Zoom. And now here they are in real life. And, you know, at least it gives you an in already to say hello. There's a weird sort of camaraderie too, I think, that we went through this Zoom stuff together. Remember that horrible mic we did? And isn't it great to be here in person now doing this? So
Absolutely.
some good stuff came out of it. Maybe this is an advantage of starting a little later. You talked about your work ethic, which is not to say anyone at any age can have a good work ethic, but the fact that you did have to just sort of grind away at a career with so many hours for so many years, that was an advantage, right? Once you started doing stand-up.
The thing about stand-up is that so much of the work is the work that no one sees. And it takes so much effort so that it will appear effortless when you're on stage, that having this self-discipline to put structure into your day. So whatever other obligations you have, whether you still have like a 9-to-5 job because you got to pay your bills and stand up doesn't pay a lot, if much ever, for a lot of people, or you got a dentist appointment, you got to make sure your clothes get washed, you got to go to the grocery store, you got all the things of just life. So having the self-discipline to create a schedule that will also include whatever your writing process is key. Because otherwise, how do you do it?
Yeah. The number of times, again, where I am, where we have less opportunity to get on stage and I see someone once a week and they're like, well, I wrote this morning because I knew this mic was here, or I got nothing new since last week. Well, what'd you do in the last week?
Right. And it could have just been life got in the way, which is fair. That happens.
Certainly.
But I think if you treat something like a hobby, it's a hobby. And if you treat it like a job, it's a job. If you treat comedy like a job, but you also need another job because you have to pay the bills and there's practical issues you have to deal with, navigating those two things is that's like the trick to making it work. And that's why, you know, when comics do achieve a certain level of success and maybe they get on TV and then they start headlining and they can quit that day job, I think that's a huge moment in their comedy progression. And then at that point, if they have the discipline, I think that's one of those moments and one of the reasons why like the learning curve in comedy, it just gets steeper and steeper. It doesn't trail off over time because as you get further along, you get more and more opportunities, which is how you get better. It just accelerates. And you see it with certain people where they get past a certain point where all of a sudden everyone wants them on their shows. And then you see them 6 months later and they're 10 times as funny as they were 6 months before.
So you touched on something about how much time you have during the day based on your financial situation, whether you're holding down another job. Without having to get into specifics, when you left your Wall Street career, did you go straight into comedy full time? Did you have a little bit of a cushion to rest on? Because I think that determines what kind of gigs you go for, how many gigs you go for, if you're trying to pay your rent versus choosing them maybe more on what kind of work you're going to get done, whether you want to drive 200 miles. Where were you at when you started comedy as far as that element of it?
Well, I was lucky so that when it ended, I got a little bit of severance, right? And I did fart around for a little bit there. And then I took that class again. And then I was looking for another job and also doing open mics every day. And then eventually I thought, I'm going to stop looking for a job and just give myself like 3 months of just writing and doing open mics and see where I get. And then I just kept extending that. And then I eventually made a budget where I was like, okay, here's how much time I have. And when the bank account gets down to this, then there needs to be money coming in. And it's not going to be comedy because it's not a realistic time frame to make any money doing comedy. So at some point I'll need some other source of income. And then kind of like as that business plan was kind of nearing its completion, where there was going to be a decision point, is when the pandemic hit, where it's like, well, what can you do? The bank account's going to get a little lower than I had thought. And that's just how it works. And then we'll figure it out as we go. At some point here, I may end up trying to get a little bit of other work on the side just to slow the cash burn.
But it's a nice, at least a nice luxury to have for a while.
Yeah.
That you could go and do that.
There's so many issues with doing this as an slightly older person. And one of the benefits is one, having a cash cushion. And then I guess the other big benefit is just life experience to draw on. And then there's the like 100 costs.
Yeah. I admire so much that when people in their 20s make that commitment, that I'm going full bore into this, because it's such a risky thing. I think most people outside of comedy don't realize how difficult it is, beyond the big high profile people you see, to actually earn a living.
I mean, most people make that commitment in their, or say early to mid 20s, and then 5 to 6 years later, they get a job. Maybe they still do a little comedy here and there, but a lot of people disappear.
Yeah. Well, they also have the constitution versus whether I would at this age to live with 4 or 5 roommates and,
right,
have that sacrifice and be able to split up the finances a little bit.
Sure.
So as we're exploring this idea of starting later and this arc that we go through, what are your long-term goals?
It's interesting. I would say like none of my goals are financial, just because I feel like that's not something you can really control, which doesn't mean that I'm ignoring that piece of it. Right. Because you do have to pay your bills, and I don't want to end up living in a cardboard box because I did comedy too long. I differentiate kind of between like goals and sort of like dreams. Like there are certain things in comedy that'd be really cool if you got to that point. Let's make something up. Like how wild would it be to headline Carnegie Hall or Radio City? That'd be wild. Sometimes I would lie in bed and imagine that I'm scoring the, winning goal in the 7th game of the Stanley Cup Finals, right? To me, that's not that different than lying in bed imagining walking out at like Carnegie Hall or something. So you can have those sorts of thoughts. But I think like goals have to be a little more practical. Even certain clubs, just to have the opportunity to audition is a goal, because I'm a very process-oriented person. And this is sort of something I learned in finance, was I don't care about the outcome. All I care about is that I had a process that I believed in, that I followed, and then the outcomes will be whatever they're going to be. And if it's not what I want, then I just have to keep going until it is.
And I think that's an important attitude to keeping yourself disciplined to writing every day.
Right. Doesn't matter if you generate something. Yeah.
If you had a bad show, or you had 3 or 4 days in a row where you didn't generate anything, there are people who get depressed and then they don't do anything for 2 weeks. But if you've got that thing every day, I work at this every day, something's going to come out of it. I've seen that with myself. If I write every day, it's going to take me 10, 12 days, 2 weeks, roughly, before I produce like one joke. I'm like, that's a keeper.
Right.
And those days in between are depressing, but you have to go, well, that was a day where I tried and maybe I didn't produce anything great, but maybe tomorrow is the day that happens, and you just keep at it.
Absolutely. Towards the end of my finance career, the last thing I did was on the investing side, and we were running like a $5 billion stock portfolio. And I never cared if a stock we bought went up or down. I never cared. It didn't matter. All that mattered is that the decision that was made to buy it in the first place followed the process, and we did it right. Because after that, all that has to happen is 51 out of 100 times we're right, we'll make money. We're not going to be right every time. And I feel like, yeah, it's the same. It's what you're saying. It's you're putting in the time. Because if you've written one good joke, you can write another. It's just a question of how long it takes to find it. Yeah. And you just got to keep plugging each day and be disciplined, and it'll appear at some point. It'll come in like clumps, right? You can have a few days or a few weeks of where nothing funny or usable comes out. And then all of a sudden you have 30 minutes where you write like 10 minutes of great stuff comes out. You're like, where did that come from? But you know where that came from? It came from all that other stuff.
Right.
It's just, your mind had to just churn and get out this other stuff out of the way to find the gold,
Yeah, because if you sit there and analyze, what did I do today that was different? There's no answer. It just comes. And again, that's frustrating. But if you can keep at it, not to be like corny or artsy about it, but sometimes I'll just think, maybe tomorrow I'll write the funniest joke I've ever written.
Yeah.
It could happen.
Yeah.
Try to keep the thought out that maybe I've already written the funniest joke I've ever written.
Right. I've noticed that I'll go through a period where I hate every joke I've ever written. And what I've noticed over time, and like, I'm like, oh, none of this is funny. I don't know why anyone has ever laughed at any of these. And then I always feel like that happens right before something really good happens. It's not been a linear progression. It's been these step functions. And before every step, there's this period of time where I think I'm terrible. I don't know the psychology behind that or why that happens, but I've noticed it repeatedly. When I start getting sick and hate the stuff, all of a sudden something good happens.
Maybe there's something subconsciously that's pushing you, like a flight or fight response of, boy, if I'm going to keep progressing or be any good at this, I better do better than I did with all this other stuff.
Right. Or my brain has gotten to a higher standard or something. And I don't know, but it's an interesting process how this all works.
Yeah, there's always a fine line. How much do you analyze it and how much do you just let it happen? Because you can tie yourself in knots.
Oh, yeah.
I found that 2020, with having that time, that year and a half, where things are so different, did it change your perspective on your goals at all?
It made me maybe a little more time sensitive, which sucks in the sense it's the one thing you can't control, but just wanting things to happen a little faster. But I don't think it changed my goals. If anything, maybe it just made some of the goals seem a little bit more possible in a way.
You're what, early 40s?
Yeah. Mid 40s.
So I'm significantly older than you. I think that what that year and a half did to me was that moved me so much further along the timeline.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, wow. Okay. Now I have even less time.
I had the moments during 2020 where I was like, has this always been a waste of time?
Yeah.
But what are you going to do?
Right. Yeah. You can't look back any more than you can look back and say, why didn't I start at an earlier time?
Right. And look, I think if I'd started in my 20s, who knows what would have happened? Maybe I would have been no good and would have quit because I just didn't have the same discipline or perspective that I have now. Like, who knows?
Yeah, I definitely feel that about myself. I feel like even having less knowledge about how to attack writing and structuring comedy.
Right.
Maybe that's the 10-year thing when you're younger, is it takes you that much longer to go through that process of understanding. Whereas if we had a little bit of experience or had even absorbed more comedy by the time you're 30, 40, 50, it gives you maybe more of an instinct where you're going to go with something.
And the irony then is that when you start a little older, you're much less interesting to all of the gatekeepers. So you do have to be that much better to get noticed, because I've noticed that there is and it's probably not just comedy, it's probably entertainment broadly, but people seem to think that new and young are synonyms.
Right.
And they're very different. And like, it's funny, you go to like a showcase, the house is like, and we're a showcase of the best young up and coming comics. And then they bring you up and you're like, I'm 40, dude. Like, I think you meant new, not young, but
there's difference between new, young, and fresh. You're also fresh. You're still relatively
you can still be fresh. Absolutely. I just showered. I'm fresh, but but I wouldn't say young.
That perception bothered me when I first started, because especially you're doing so many crappy gigs.
Yeah.
And when I stepped on stage and I've already got gray in my hair and I'm a middle-aged man, I had this paranoia, that thing about the audience judging you.
Right.
I didn't want them to look at me and say, this guy either had a career and now he's on the downside, which is why he's playing this bar.
Right.
Or he was never any good. He's been at a level of mediocrity for 30 years, which is why he's playing this show. So I, pretty early on, I tried to write an opener that addressed, this is when I started, late bloomer thing, whatever, put it into context to dispel that, which I don't think is any different than what they tell you, sort of comedy 101. You go on stage, you have something peculiar about you physically. Right. Address that, get it out of the way. Don't have the audience thinking about it. Make a self-deprecating comment. Did you face any of that? Maybe you didn't quite have that perception as an older person.
No, I know exactly what you're talking about. I got concerned that when I walk on stage, you want to be confident and command the room. So you walk on as a middle-aged guy confidently, and everyone in the audience thinks that you've been doing comedy for 30 years.
But why haven't I heard of you?
Yeah. And then you're not that good, because no one is when they first start. And they're confused. I wrote a couple lines that addressed it. And then I remember on one audition, one of the, judges got mad at me for mentioning my age, because she was the same age. And I don't know if she misunderstood the joke. Like everything, you exaggerate and tweak to make the joke work. I said I started comedy at 40, because that's a nice, easy way to say it. And I'd say something like starting comedy at 40 is like starting to eat kale during the heart attack. Like, that was kind of the crux of it. And she was like, I'm 40 and I don't need to mention it. I'm like, yeah, but you've been doing comedy for 20 years, which is what people expect when you're 40. They don't expect you to be new.
Right.
And then I kind of went back and forth on, if I can come off looking younger than I am, like if someone might be like, oh, I thought you were in your mid 30s. I'm like, well, then maybe I just shouldn't mention it. Let them think that. And I still go back and forth on whether I should mention it or not.
For me, it took a while. Well, I mean, I mentioned it for that to deflate that situation, but there
Yeah.
was also a conflict there where you don't want to acknowledge it
Mm.
necessarily. Even maybe that's more personal. You don't want to
Well,
say
it's
I'm
almost
really the man.
because it's my perception of how the industry thinks. Someone's like, you go in and you say you're 40, and they're like, well, we don't have to pay attention to this guy because he's never gonna make it. So he's no use to us. But the burden in comedy now, the reason that doesn't bother me as much anymore is the burden in comedy now on everyone is you have to prove that you're useful before anyone cares anyway, right? And it's a very transparent thing. Like if 6 months from now I had 100,000 Instagram followers, I'll get a lot of stage time because that shows that there's an audience for me in some way, shape, or form. And I think everyone has to and has the opportunity, in a sense, to try to prove that there's demand for themselves, even though sometimes it's sort of smoke and mirrors and you might not live up to it. It feels like that's where it's migrating to. We can tell if you've got a following, so why do we don't care about you until you do? At least it's sort of transparent.
So let's talk about that in terms of things like TikTok. Did you have any self-consciousness about getting on something like TikTok, which I think was perceived, maybe not so much now, but as a young person's medium?
Oh, it was 100%. It was a young person's medium. And then as soon as the old people get on, the young people don't like it as much. But look, I think I felt a little weird about it because I just didn't know what to do with it. And I'm not gonna learn a dance. And I also felt like, what if I did something weird that actually became popular, but has nothing to do with my comedy? How does that work? And then over time, you realize like getting a following any way you can do it, as long as it's legal and you're comfortable with it, is helpful for your comedy. It's as simple as that. So I kind of got over it and I started talking to the camera. On TikTok in particular, I found that stand-up clips of mine don't do very well, but every once in a while, if I just say something weird into the camera, it does okay.
Yeah.
That's part of that daily grind. Put up 1 or 2 TikToks a day, or one a day, or 4 a week, or whatever you're comfortable with. It's just like filling out the reports for the boss. It's part of the grind. And you don't know what's going to hit or not hit. What you do know is if you don't do it, it won't work. So you got to do something.
Yeah, I was very, very hit and miss with it for about the first year. I think I threw up 3 or 4 clips. And again, it was just me talking to the camera, coming up with a short joke that I made up that day. And, you're getting, I don't think I got more than 3 figures of views. And then recently I had a little bit of a success and a bump. And it's been interesting because it was a thematic thing that I'm trying to do. And one joke particularly took off and suddenly it takes a big leap, but I still find myself fascinated and somewhat self-conscious about who's following me.
Right.
And I'm shocked when I see someone that looks like high school or college age has followed me. I'm like, well, maybe that's good.
Right.
And then recently I got knocked down a peg when I saw 2 younger people comment under a joke, this was funny. And then the person comes back and goes, I wish he was my grandpa. So that was fun.
When I get comments, I like every comment, but I try not to read them.
Yes.
But what I also realized, though, is like if I post a stand-up clip on TikTok and it gets 100 views, which is terrible, right? What I realized, though, is you're still kind of creating a resume for yourself, because I had a booker of a comedy club recently start following me on TikTok. And I was like, oh, in my mind, now I'm posting for them. And I don't care how many people watch the post. I want it to be something that they think is funny and is good and high quality because they book a club, right? And I think the same way with my Instagram Reels, it's almost a comedy resume. And I've definitely had a few people book me. And when I found out why, or someone gave me my name and they ended up using me, and they said they picked me from the list of names because they looked at my Instagram and thought I might work well with whatever crowd they anticipated getting, because they can see the material. They're not booking me to headline like I'm going to sell tickets when my video has 100 views. My sense is the people that get a lot of views on stand-up comedy clips on TikTok are comedians that are also already relatively famous and have a big following.
Someone like Sam
Morril, Taylor Tomlinson, Mark Normand. Of course, those clips are going to do well because they've already got a built-in audience. And of course, they're super funny, so they deserve it. But even if you're very funny but unknown, it's going to be very hard to get that algorithm to just pick you up and blast you out to people.
But I think your approach with thinking about it is I want to put something out there that's quality, that's more important to me, that a booker likes it than 100,000 strangers.
Right.
That's the way to pursue it.
Right. And eventually, hopefully one will hit both. Right.
Yeah. Well, we see a ton of, I mean, like you said, to your point is they're not booking you to headline, but we do see people that have, I think, maybe strictly done social media, getting booked in clubs, and they're getting booked on off nights, but they're getting booked to headline.
Oh, absolutely. Because if you have a certain number of followers on social media, those people will come out. And if you can sell tickets, and then the question is, are you any good at stand up or whatever you're going to do on stage, which might be a mix of things. And can you create a recurring audience, which is, the ultimate thing. But if you're the booker or the promoter and you're like, this person can sell 400 tickets at least once, why wouldn't I book them? Like, that's a great show and I'm going to make some money. You know, if the next show no one shows up, then you just don't book that person anymore. But there's very little risk. Whereas you book someone you think is super funny and has no following, you're going to have to like promote the hell out of it, probably give away a bunch of free tickets, paper the room. And that person might not pay off for years until they develop the following and then come back and can actually sell the room out. That's the old school sort of, it took 5, 10, 15 years to be a real traveling headliner that can sell tickets. That's all sort of changing. But I also think you need a niche, right? Like, which is the other thing about being older, is that you have something in life to draw on to try to create your niche. That's what's very successful for people online. Like, if you think about who you are and in some category, like I went to MIT, can I somehow be like the MIT comedian? And can I find a way to connect with the tens of thousands of MIT alums that might enjoy stand-up? I guess I could try that. And you got to find things like that. That's the way I think you do it. Some people have more obvious categories to go after than others, you know?
Yeah.
I also find a lot of my peers who are super supportive of me doing stand-up. A lot of them aren't even on Instagram. The people 10 years younger are, but they're not. A lot of them are still just on Facebook. And Facebook isn't as, I think, critical from a following standpoint. So I want to be like, hey, can you guys all just join Instagram, even if it's just to follow me? Because it's tough when the logical group that would be like your base isn't participating. Like, their kids are on TikTok, they're not.
Exactly. I had a friend of mine recently say, yeah, my daughter shared one of your TikToks with me because they're not on there.
Yeah.
But like you said, it's a job, it's another writing job, and it's something we're expected to do, and put your effort in every day and put out something you think is solid. And
what also creates, I don't know if you find this, because I know like you have a lot of very quick, punchy jokes, right? And as you point out, it can take a while to kind of get those right. Is it a way to like try a premise and to have like a deadline? Like, every morning at 10 a.m., I'm going to talk to the camera and put a one-liner out on TikTok, which creates, like, from when you wake up in the morning, there's that pressure because there's this deadline that you've created for yourself. And sometimes that helps you find something. And they're not all going to work, but as long as it's not something completely embarrassing, who cares?
Yeah, I've tried to figure out a way recently to take some of the stuff I've put on TikTok, which still is generally the structure of the kind of stuff I do, and try and incorporate it into the set seamlessly.
Right.
So I'm still working on that.
I mean, I use Twitter for that a lot, where I would just throw out a premise and just see if it got a certain number of likes within the first hour I posted it, then I'd kind of be like, okay, I should write the joke now because this is an interesting thing for people. And a couple of times I've just taken those and then said them into the camera and posted them on TikTok and used it in the same way. Like, if more than the average number of people that view my stuff view this, maybe that tells me it's more interesting and it's worth exploring. And the form that it takes on stage might be completely different. I just know that the idea has some merit.
I'm even looking at, like, the anecdote I told you about, the reaction of somebody saying, I wish he was my grandpa. I'm talking about that now on stage, and that's getting a laugh. People my age think it's funny, like, oh, I could see that happening. And then the younger people in the audience, they also think it's funny because they could have said it.
Right. I have a similar joke. It wasn't a comment. It was a real live comment. Like, someone came up to me after a show. Like, I opened for a 30-year-old female comic on the road. And after one of the shows, I was standing beside her as the audience was leaving. And a guy came up to both of us and said, like, great show, really enjoyed it. And then asked me if I was her father. He basically was implying that the only reason I got to open for her was because I'm her father or something like that. It hurts so much, right? But now it's like a little story and there's more to it that I talk about on stage because it's funny.
So we talked a little bit about goals, long-term things. What do you have going on, coming up? What are you working on?
On June 2nd, which may be in the future or the past, depending on when this comes out, I'm going to record an hour at West Side Comedy Club here in New York. I just kind of put that on the books a few months ago because I wanted to force myself to do it. My thought, like, worst case is it'll be some fun clips for social media. Best case would be that there's an album in there and or something that I'd put on YouTube. I reject use of the word special, and I don't like even calling myself the headliner. It implies too much. I'm calling it Adam Goes Last, and it's not a special, it'll be a regular. That's what it'll be. But it's going to be fun. It's an hour of jokes, and there's some great openers. It's fun because 2 of the openers are people that have had me open for them. So it's kind of a fun thing that they agreed to do the show, and it'll be fun.
So looking forward, as we put everything in sort of the perspective of the age and how long it takes to accomplish certain things, do you have a time limit on this career?
If June 2nd doesn't go well, I'll be retiring on June 3rd.
Okay.
No. I mean, you must feel this too. It's like so hard. Like, you want to have a time limit, but you can't because it's just arbitrary. From time to time, I'll get a job offer. right? Someone from my past in finance will call up and say, hey, I just started a new investment company. Any interest? And I mean, at this point, I'm a little stale. So the effort to ramp back up would be a lot of work. But at some point, I might have to say yes to something like that, or to go seek it out on my own. And I wouldn't quit comedy, but I obviously would have to slow down. And it would be a financial decision. And also at some point, just a prudent, like, well, it doesn't seem like anyone wants me. But I think the problem with that is, I think for most comics that make it, it's a slow grind, right? There's that old phrase, like, it took me 20 years to be an overnight success.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of that in comedy. So you don't want to like give up. So I don't think I will ever stop. There could be a period of time where I have to slow the pace down. And frankly, I've already started having those mental discussions, not about like getting a day job or something, but about like just time allocation. Because for the longest time, I felt like I can't be out there trying to sell a product that I haven't created yet. Right. And now if I feel like, hey, I got a good 30, 45, 60 minutes that I really am proud of, now I have a product I can sell. And so now I need to like switch a little bit of that time from product development to like marketing. Up until very recently, I've been doing very little marketing because it's all just write, open mics, shows, develop.
Yeah.
But now I'm like, hey, now the balance has to change because now I got to be selling. That's another mind-numbing task because it's a lot of emails and phone calls and going places with a low hit rate, because that's what selling is. You don't sell every person you talk to.
Well, I think even if you pull back eventually from time you put into it, what I'm finding is what's still satisfying is trying to pursue things that I find interesting.
Yeah.
Or that make me feel like I've accomplished something or I've gotten better at something, as opposed to necessarily the quantity of things.
I wouldn't put the work in and all the time and all the stuff behind the scenes that no one sees if it wasn't just incredibly fun to walk out on a stage with just a microphone in front of people and try to say words in a certain order to make them laugh. It's just so fun.
Yeah, that's key. I think if part of your reason is you're pursuing it because you're enjoying it,
right,
and you're having fun at it and you enjoy the process, you'll always be in a good place. Well, good luck with the special. Well, sorry, the regular. It's coming up. I know it's going to go great, and I'm looking forward to seeing whatever comes out of that.
Oh, thanks, Ben.
And like I said, hopefully I'll see you out there in the real world very soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This has been fun.
All right, take care.
Thanks, Bill.
Hey, everybody, thanks for listening to this episode of Never Better Than Late. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and share with your friends.